Oh, hello. Welcome to episode 5 of the Comprehensible Podcast. In this episode, we're going to look at an aspect of language learning, specifically the difference between extensive and intensive reading. As I mentioned in the first episode, this podcast gets its name from the idea of comprehensible input and comprehensible input theory developed by Stephen Krashen in the 1970s. Comprehensible input theory is closely related to another concept known as extensive reading. Extensive reading is not the opposite really, but maybe the counterpart of intensive reading. Simply put, extensive reading involves reading books or any material really in a language you're learning that contain only or almost only language that you're already familiar with and understand well. Intensive reading, on the other hand, involves reading material that contains a significant amount of grammar and or vocabulary that you do not already know. The idea being that this is the language that you will focus on and learn. Both of these types of reading are important. It's no use reading only language that you already understand because you will never encounter any new language, so you will never learn anything new and never improve at all. At the same time, reading only new language that you need to learn means that you'll never get an opportunity to consolidate and review what you've already learned. And also reading will always be a laborious and often confusing experience. And you'll never get the opportunity to just casually read for fun in your target language. Of course, it's unlikely that you would ever do only one of these extremes. You're always likely to encounter some new language in everything you read near your current level. And even if you're reading something well above your current level, there'll always be some language that you understand in there. But it's a very good idea to make sure that you keep these two types of reading separate in your learning schedule and strike a good balance between them. Let's look at each in turn. Extensive reading is great because it's through this kind of reading that you really get to feel like you're making progress and that all of your efforts to learn a new language is paying off. It's a great feeling to read a book cover to cover in another language. And if you can do it without having to consult a dictionary or only having to do that a few times for the whole book, then all the better. It's a real dopamine hit and it boosts your motivation and drives you on to keep learning. It also gives you the opportunity to consolidate and review the language you already know, so you don't forget it, and it gets incorporated into the language that's readily available to you and that you can use easily. Just like practicing a musical instrument makes playing it easier and more natural, and practicing specific songs makes playing them effortless, so you don't even have to think about it. So it is with language. The more you encounter and practice with language that you know, the more readily available it becomes to you, and the less you have to think about it. What's more, because you're not putting all of your focus into learning the grammar and vocabulary, your brain has more opportunity to notice the subtleties of when certain vocabulary and grammar is being used and when it's not. You have more bandwidth to use on learning how and when to use the grammar, vocab, idioms, and aphorisms that you've learned. This pattern recognition is largely unconscious. So it happens without you having to do anything, and even without you noticing. There's a part of your memory called implicit memory that automatically learns patterns as you go about your day. It's this implicit memory that allows you to perform familiar actions automatically. This is how you learn to play an instrument, or drive a car, or tie your shoelaces effortlessly. And these are all things that were really difficult when you first started. In his comprehensible input theory, Stephen Krashen distinguishes between language learning and language acquisition, and suggests that the latter of these, language acquisition, is the goal. Acquired language is the language that you can use automatically without even thinking about it. You acquire your native language rather than learn it. And you should aim to do the same with the other languages that you learn. And it's through implicit memory that we acquire language. So for Krashen and many others, reading material that has very little new language in it is absolutely vital to becoming fluent. The Extensive Reading Foundation say that in order to be counted as extensive reading, your reading material should be 98 to 100% language that you already know. And you should be able to read at 150 to 200 words a minute. They also recommend reading one book a week at this level. The best reading material to use for extensive reading are special books called graded readers. These are books written or rewritten especially for language learners and pitched at learners of specific learning levels. Different publishers have different systems of classification, but usually they grade the reading material by the number of headwords that they contain. So what's a headword? Basically, if a book contains a word, no matter how many times it's used, that's counted as one headword. So, for example, any book probably contains the word the hundreds of times at least, but the word the counts as one headword. So the sentence, the cat sat on the mat and the rat sat on the cat, has 13 words, but only 7 headwords. The idea, of course, is that some words and grammar are very common, and you can actually say quite a lot with relatively few words. These are likely to be the first words that a language learner learns. Then as they continue to learn, they'll pick up more words that are less common. And as you pick up more vocabulary, you'll probably pick up more grammar at the same time. So learners at a given level will probably know more or less the same words and grammar. And the number of headwords that you know is a fairly good indicator of your overall general level. This makes headwords a really useful indicator of a graded reader's level. Graded readers are often novels, either purpose written or adapted classics, or history books or biographies. It's a good to get a mix of fiction and non-fiction reading under your belt. Because different types of books tend to use different styles of language. And another thing about extensive reading with graded readers is that you get the chance to learn something new, improve your general knowledge, and widen your reading in addition to the language practice that you're getting. Graded listening is just as important as graded reading, and many graded readers include an audio version of the book on a CD or a link to an MP3 version on the publisher's website. So you can kill two birds with one stone and get some invaluable listening practice into the bargain. Look in the description for a link to a list of the major English graded reader publishers. Intensive reading is important because it exposes you to new language, be it vocabulary, grammar, idioms, or whatever, and allows you to progress with your learning. Intensive reading is the kind of reading that you usually find in a language course books. These books will often give you a passage of text to read that contains the grammar and vocabulary that's the focus of the chapter, and they'll explain this grammar and vocab and give a bunch of exercises to give you some practice with them. You can use any material for intensive reading though. Books that are extensive reading for one person are intensive reading for others. Obviously, if you're using non-course book material for intensive reading, you'll need some way to research the language that you come across. This isn't hard nowadays, of course. There's a great many websites and translation apps to help you. The Extensive Reading Foundation suggests that intensive reading should be between 90 and 98% language that you already know and understand. They classify anything less than 90% understanding as reading pain because it tends to do little more than frustrate and demotivate you. This kind of material probably does more harm than good. And as we already know, anything above 98% is classified as extensive reading. I'm learning Korean, and what I like to do is find a graded reader or another book that was written for Korean learners, but that's a bit above my level. I set about reading it, and when I come across language that I don't understand, I use Google Translate, iOS built-in Korean English dictionary, the Hi Native app, and a website called How to Study Korean to look up any language I don't know. The iOS dictionary is really good for vocabulary. It's better at giving you all the different possible meanings of a word than Google Translate. Plus, it gives you a ton of example sentences. Google Translate is better for translating a whole sentence into English so that I can try to work out the grammar myself. It's not uncommon for me to use Google Translate only to realize that I actually already knew all the grammar, but I've never seen it used in this way before or something like that. How to Study Korean is a fantastic website for Korean learners that has a page for just about every Korean grammar construction under the sun. Equivalents for learning English might be something like English Page, Perfect English Grammar, or the Grammarly website, although these sites are written entirely in English. And there might be sites in your own language that are more convenient in that respect. Hi Native is a knowledge exchange for language learners, whatever language they're learning. You can post language questions, and native speakers, the vast majority of whom I expect are also learners of other languages themselves, will reply with answers. It's a really nice, friendly, and helpful community, and it's well worth checking out if you're not a member already. Another intensive reading practice I like to do in Korean that also gives me some great listening practice at the same time is to watch podcasts similar to this one, but in Korean, and read along with the transcription or Korean subtitles, researching anything that I don't understand in the same way that I do for books. Actually, I listen to all or some of the podcast first, and if I understand most of it, then I just treat it as extensive listening. If I struggle with it at all, then I crack open the Google Translate and my other favorite tools and treat it as an intensive learning exercise. Then I practice with the language a bit, using it to make sentences of my own and what have you. Then listen to it again a bit later. And hopefully it's now more or less an extensive listening exercise. My personal opinion is that listening practice should have a much lower listening pain threshold than the extensive reading foundation suggests for their reading pain threshold. My reason for thinking this is that people's listening skills are usually significantly weaker than their reading skills. So language that seems unintelligible when you listen to it is often well within your reading skill set. And the challenge of listening to spoken language is often just making sense of the language that you already know when you hear it, and giving your brain a chance to learn and decode the sounds into meaning. From my personal experience with Korean, even though you can't understand what's being said, your implicit memory and the pattern recognition parts of your brain are working away at trying to make sense of it. And they do a pretty good job, even though it doesn't seem like it at the time. You can help these parts of your brain along by reading what you've heard afterwards, then listening to it again, so that you gradually learn to connect sound with meaning. Okay, so to summarize and conclude, it's important to get a mix of extensive and intensive reading and listening. Extensive reading and listening is great for motivation and helps to make language learning enjoyable. Intensive reading and listening introduces you to new language and helps you to learn vocab and grammar rules explicitly. Material that you understand 98% of or above counts as extensive reading. You should also be reading at 150 to 200 words a minute. Material that you understand 90 to 98% of counts as intensive reading. Material that you understand less than 90% of counts as annoying and counterproductive, and you shouldn't do it. This is not necessarily the case with listening, though. As long as you understand 90% of it when you read it, it will probably help you, but you have to stick with it. Graded readers are the perfect resource for extensive reading practice. There are a great many publishers producing these books, and they often come with an audio version so that you can get your listening practice in too. Almost any kind of resource can be turned into an intensive reading exercise. If you have a few carefully chosen apps and websites at the ready. But remember that you should choose reading materials that you already understand 90% of or more. As a final note, Stephen Krashen's comprehensible input theory and others like it advocate almost entirely extensive reading and listening. More traditional classroom methods based on the audio-linguistic method focus almost entirely on intensive reading and listening. My own opinion is that it's best to get a balanced mix of both. Extensive input is generally slower than intensive input, and it's probably not the best for passing grammar tests because it often doesn't give you the ability to say why this or that is the right grammar form to use, much the same as with your native language. On the other hand, it is amazing for building fluency, and once it's learned, it's pretty much learned for life. On the other hand, intensive input is quicker and it gives you an explicit knowledge of grammar rules and what have you. But the language won't be so readily available to you. It won't be so easy and natural to use, and you'll forget it more easily. Making sure that you get the best of both worlds seems like a no-brainer. In my one-on-one teaching nowadays, I'm basing more of my in-class, explicit, intensive teaching on the implicit, extensive input that I set for students to do outside of class. This makes sure that the students are getting a good balance of both techniques, and it keeps the two synchronized and mutually reinforcing. If you're interested in that, then feel free to check out my online courses on Langu. Link in the description. Okay, so that's about it for this episode. I hope you learned something useful. If there's any topics that you would specifically like me to cover, tell me about it in the comments and I'll see what I can do for you. All right, signing out. Until next time, bye-bye.